Milwaukee show. We're talking with noted mythicist Kenneth Humphreys, all the way from England tonight, talking to us about the historicity of the Bible itself, Old Testament and New. How do you address the fact that so many people are willing to see the obviousness of the Genesis fable as a metaphor, yet continue to believe that Moses and Exodus and all of these other Old Testament stories have some basis in historical fact?
These fables of the ancient Jews are true. They say, because historians say quite the reverse. They know that it is essentially a mythology for an ancient people. But Hollywood, the cinema, the TV channels, they are always perpetuating these comforting stories that we, if you like, you could say we know and love. The story of Noah's Ark, the story of wanderings in the desert and the escape from Egypt. These stories have long been dropped in historical circles, but they have not been dropped in the public mind. And next time we come round to some particular religious festival, we'll get another special that perpetuates those silly ideas.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's get into why they're silly. I think there's a lot. Maybe people don't necessarily know. We know the basic Exodus story, but what are the pieces that really start to fail? I mean, we can start. I think at Abraham. You mentioned the tricks the original Pharaoh, which is unnamed, with his extremely beautiful 75-year-old wife, and convinces that he's a sister, and it's just a great con man here. What's the story? Bring us in.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is a charming story, isn't it? Because but you've seen you expose that silly story for what it is by simply comparing different comments in different parts of the Bible. If you take the ages of those particular characters, Abraham and his wife, you see what age they are at a certain stage. So when he takes her to the court of Pharaoh and she is so unbelievably beautiful, she gets taken into the harem, you begin to wonder, well, they must have kept their looks a lot longer in those ancient days. And of course, they repeat the story like 20 years later with another king, and she must be into her 90s by then. It's farcical when you look at it. Now, why do they say such things? Well, of course, like all the stories, they have a theological, they have a religious purpose. That's why. It's not meant to be read as fact like science. It is a religious story.
Brian's got a list, a timeline here. Go, Brian.
Yeah, so Abraham itself, I don't think there's any real evidence that he existed, but the myth continues to go on as he sires Isaac, and then Jacob, or Isaac sires Jacob, and then Joseph. It is engaging with the Pharaoh. So you see, like, the Israelites, taking a high position. I think you mentioned Grand Vizier, based on his predictions of forecasts, which basically were good or bad, which is, where do I get that job? Where I just say good, bad, predict it, and I get to be the Grand Vizier, which sounds cool. I mean, is that what the Bible says? And is there any evidence for Jacob at all?
Well, I'm not. From what I could make out of what you were saying there, Brian, I'm not quite sure what the question was. But in terms of stories, there is difficulty with them because there is no historical basis for them. You have to either read them as history, read them as allegory, read them as anecdotal, whatever way you approach them. But they're always justified on the basis of the fact that it tells an important truth that we should all take on board. Now, of course, my point would be whether that we can even credit that or not. The points they often make are quite antiquated in terms of the society we live in. This is, they are drawn from a semi-nomadic agrarian society of very basic technologies. It's very patriarchal. It's got very crude and very harsh morality, and you know, those stories that tell, in whatever sense you read them, are just irrelevant to today. You know, quite apart from the fact that they may be fantasies, you know, they tell an irrelevant tale about, you know, a very male-dominated, a very conservative and intolerant society.
Interesting. I mean, and it's certainly not as applicable today, but what were they trying to get at then? But pretend we're, you know, in 300 BC. What are we supposed to read into this story if we're back then?
Well, yeah, what you are reading into that story is the sort of things you would probably be instructed in if you were to take yourself off to the Islamic Republic or the Caliphate and imbibe their dogmas. You know, the idea of a patriarchy in which, you know, you simply obey the rules dictated by the priests. You obey, you don't question, you don't jump out of line. It's a very hierarchical society. It's one that certainly respects the elders far more than our current society. It's one that holds women in low regard. But these are the rules. You talk about 300 years BC. This is the sort of society you had then. It's a very, very brutal society of it did, if you like, establish some control, some harmony. Did tend to hold the tribe together. Yes, it did that. It gave them guidelines to live by, rules to follow, and that's how it justified itself. It was brutality reinforced by rules said to be God's laws.
There's a lot of competing mythicist theories. It's not as cut and dried as someone like me would want it to be. When it appears that the mythicist position is based on actual research, I keep hoping that it'll be more concrete and more all-encompassing in terms of the researchers who are at the forefront. Will there ever be consensus, or is the information that you uncover and that others like Dr. Carrier and David Fitzgerald and D.M. Murdoch and some of the other researchers we've talked to, will there ever be consensus, or is this really just another matter of extrapolating and interpolating information as subjectively?
Yeah, you have a good point. You make a good point there. Yeah, because if you like, if the innocent public is presented by a charming idea, and all that mythicists can present in response is to say, well, it's just not true, then you will have a problem of acceptance, because people like these stories. People like the thoughts expressed by some of them. I mean, I've always been aware that, in a sense, that atheism, let alone mythicism, atheism presents a not very comfortable idea, which is to say, this is our own life, and when we reach the end of it, we face oblivion. Now most people would find that a little bit distressing, so they will always prefer the anodyne fable to the brutal or unadorned truth. Yes, that's unfortunately true. Do the people who flock to the churches really want to accept that there's no point in doing so? You know, you're taking away a lot of their culture and a lot of their self-identity. So we may always be facing an uphill struggle. You know, very comfortable in your own life to embrace the notions to embrace the notion that this is all invention.
Well, I definitely agree. The people who are believers are not going to have their minds changed, but what I'm really getting at is mythicists like yourself and other mythicists don't necessarily agree on what this research leads to. Will there ever be consensus there, or will this be a matter of just like different theologians have different takes on the Bible? Will mythicists always disagree?
Okay. Now I understand. If that is the point you were making, yeah. Why don't mythicists all agree? Well, yes, and you can say, well, churchmen don't agree. Christians have never all agreed with each other. So yeah, will we ever get to a stage of having a more... I think we're moving towards it. I think there will be a consensus among mythicists. Yes, I think there will. There'll always be a few on the fringes with their own quite wacky ideas. I mean, unfortunately, that is true. But I think, you know, when I look at, when I consider the works of other leading mythicists in the States, for example, like you mentioned Carrier, you mentioned Earl Doherty and Robert Price. I mean, I don't find myself really at odds to those characters. I mean, you know, there is a broad agreement there. I think we are, you know, expanding the envelope, if I can put it that way, of what mythicism means, even though there will be a few non-conformists along the way.
Now, getting back to why you couldn't believe the Exodus story. I mean, forget the parting of the Red Sea, but I mean, as it's told, I mean, they seem some of the things you bring up on JesusNeverExisted.com is the fact that the sheer number of the slaves. I mean, forget the Egyptian population. There were 2 million slaves supposedly wandering around after the plagues in the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years before they make it into the Promised Land, and there's some outrageous ideas that the Pharaoh is mentioned 155 times, but yet never named. You know, that don't.
Yeah.
It certainly led credence to this has got to be a myth. There's no evidence for 2 million people wandering around. You know, at the time. I mean, is there more to this? I mean, what can you do to somebody that says, well, it really is? There's some basis in history.
Well, some people you will never win over. Yeah, the numbers alone show that the story is bogus. You know, whether they've made 20 people into 2 million, well, I suppose you might argue something like that. But you see, you're talking of a racial origins myth. You're talking about how the Jews explain their own existence. Now, again, it's not a minority position. Most mainstream scholars know that the Exodus had never actually occurred. This great escape of a fantastic number, it would have left Egypt bereft, you know, if such a number had left. And plus the fact that, you know, as archaeologists have noted, you can find in the Sinai Desert the encampments of as few as half a dozen Bedouin as preserved over centuries, and yet the passage of a couple of million people leaves not a trace. I mean, it's obviously a fantastic tale, but you know, I know you will never win everybody over to it because they're already convinced they've got God's word in their hands. So how can they? But the story doesn't make sense, for sure. It doesn't make sense on any basis. But who's like to admit they simply were emerged from runaway Canaanites and a few bandits in the hill country? You know, would they really want to acknowledge where they came from? They've got in that story an heroic tale of how they were chosen by God. So they are the chosen people. I mean, semi-nomads coming together in a very primitive hilltop society doesn't really win the prize, does it, for national origins?
Got a bit of Monty Python in there to an American ear. Has anyone ever told you that? You there?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
I'm teasing you. When you talk like that, you get a little Monty Python going in your the humor that comes across.
I'm sometimes been described as a comic mythicist,
yes.
Because my sense of humour does. Well, I use humour deliberately because, quite honestly, when you're a non-believer and you have to plough through all this religious stuff, you need something to keep you sane and your spirit alive, because it is dreary old nonsense.
Well, and I think it exists to be ridiculed, at least in my world. So I really appreciate your take on that.
Yeah, I heard that.
Sure.
On one of the British talk shows where it's the one where you have the two audiences facing each other and they kind of moderate a debate. There was a man who said that he actually found the exact mountain where Moses came down with said tablets and cited evidence of cloth and so on and so forth. Did you watch that, and what did you make of him? that the actual the site, the Mount Sinai site where Moses is said to have come down, there's supposed to be some sort of temple there, and he said he found evidence for this. He sounded a bit of a crackpot, but he said it was brand new. And I can't remember
brand new
question time or what. And he was mostly ridiculed a bit, but he claimed it was real, and I wondered if you knew anything about this.
Well, I don't track all the nutcases who keep finding evidence for their cherished book, but I mean it's a long tradition. It's gone on since the beginning, and certainly since the birth of biblical archaeology about 200 odd years ago. You know, they've been finding the evidence that they're looking for all the time, whether it's Solomon's temple, the Ark of the Covenant, the Noah's Ark, you know, whatever. They find these things. Well, of course, they find them to their own satisfaction. They don't find them to the satisfaction of any rational archaeologist or any sensible historian. But believers find evidence everywhere. The thing that amuses me quite often is when they find, you know, images of Jesus in a grease stain or on a bottle of something, you know. The religious-minded people will find their evidence. They have evidence.
No, they do, but I think even if you don't necessarily stop the belief, you can have a theist that takes these stories as mostly mythical. It really does maybe help shape their actions, because I don't think it's necessarily all about atheism, but realizing that these are a myth. I mean, I heard Father Barron, who's a Catholic priest in the northern suburbs of Chicago, say that as the Jews moved into the Promised Land and wiped out the Canaanites and the Alawites, that this was just a metaphor for eliminating evil, that this wasn't real. It was just all a metaphor. And to that end, I want a Bible that's maybe in red and blue that just tells me what's metaphor and what's real.
Yeah. Sure, and that also has been there from the beginning. How much is allegorical? How much is literal? How much should we believe on one level or another level, or perhaps both? I mean, you know, Christians have sometimes argued it's both literally true and allegorically true. So, yeah, I can sympathise with a modern-day Christian who accepts, you know, and discounts the obvious nonsense and still holds that there was a very special man there, and maybe perhaps he was the Son of God, and he did do some nice things, and you know, the core story may be true. Now, I understand why someone would say that, but that's when we come back to the nitty-gritty of what I've written about so extensively, you know, that Jesus never existed material. That, okay, if you really think that, where is the support for such an idea? Why does it seem so difficult to find? Why is it that it's this evidence which, you know, is glitteringly clear centuries later in all the material written by believing Christians? They've got it all polished up like gold. But when you go back to the beginning, why is it vanishingly, impossible to find this material? You know, you come back to the validity or otherwise of the Gospels, and you have to say, as I've made the point, is this memory or is it a myth? Did these people memorize this material and kept it in their head for decades, or is it a story created later for other reasons? Now, if you've done what these Christians we've just been describing have done, of minimize material and take away all the nonsense, why would anyone preserve the memory of a sort of nice guy for decades before writing it down? You know, that to me would be a response to these people. If this person was so impressive, you know, why was nothing written down earlier? Why did nobody record his words at that time? Why did nobody of any significance record this material? Why is it decades later it emerges, and when it does so, it appears so similar to earlier stories? You know, now, if we were talking to a rational Christian, he must actually be somewhat troubled by that notion. And all this recent material that's now in the public domain about, the short ending of Mark's Gospel, which was the original, which has no resurrection appearances, you start to see a slightly different story, not the technicolor story that later emerges. You see a very simple story in the beginning. And that, to me, suggests the evolution of a myth, not the memory of some smart and wonderful guy.
Right. So why do they do it? Why does the myth evolve? I mean, if we get to this, and it really does sound like myth, people are going to ask for a motive, in the same way you would in a murder case. What do you think the motives are moving along based on what's happening at the time?
Well, I hope I've made that clear on a number of occasions. What is the motive? And the motive becomes one of the salvation of a religion and of a people who are bereft of that religion. If, as happened, Judaism was fatally wounded and almost destroyed by the action of the Roman armies in the multiple wars that the Jews fought with the Romans, how do you salvage the situation? What do you say to people who've believed all their life and for generations before them this idea of national salvation and being a chosen people? What do you say to such people who find themselves being forced into the arenas of the Roman world and sold on the slave markets? What can you offer them? And I think the original writer, the author of Mark's Gospel, he wrote a story of suffering and eventual redemption. That was where it began. It was to offer these people something to say, yes, God will punish us like he punished this man Jesus, and in the same way Jesus rose, so we as a people will rise. That's where it begins. That was the motive. It came out of the suffering of wars.
I see. So, like the blood sacrifice, which sometimes in modern days seems so brutal, like the crucifixion, but in that allegory for their own sufferings. So that would make a lot more sense then. Absolutely,
an allegory for their own suffering, and in many ways, and many writers have done this, they interpret Jesus himself as symbolic of Israel, as symbolic of the Jews, and he suffers, he is betrayed, he's betrayed by the leaders of the Jews, in the same way you could argue that's what happened with the Jewish state, the aristocracy of the Jews sold out to the Romans, so you've got that story of betrayal, you've got the story of suffering. The Jews suffered. They had impositions of not just the traditional taxes imposed by their own rulers, but the additional taxes imposed by the Romans, and so their suffering was undeniable. And people in that situation then, even more today perhaps, looked for divine salvation. And somebody came along and told them an encouraging story, and not to give up on their faith, not to give up on God, and in fact they could interpret the disaster as a sign of the end times. So it made perfect sense. Yes, it's got so bad, this shows that God is intervening. So, to me it makes perfect sense along those terms.
The disaster, you mean the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome in 70 AD after a series of revolts. They decided for once and all to just essentially annihilate the city, burn the temple, or burn, and not allow any of the Jewish propitiations for salvation, right? And is that the disaster you're referring to?
Well, that's the first of them. There was another war in 112, 115, and a third war, 130, 135. So there were three wars that were successively suppressed the militant side of Judaism. And when you've done that so effectively over a 60-year period, it's not surprising you get the emergence of a more pacifist version of Judaism, which reverses some of its claims. you know, and it says the Romans are okay, you know.
That does make some sense. Does it also show that how, as John's gospel, which is sounds like it's written a little bit more towards this, third war, is that why he becomes more Superman? Because, you want your God to be more powerful because the people themselves are losing power?
Well, I think that the way in which the Jesus character develops, the trajectory of his developed from a righteous man chosen by God to be visited by the Holy Spirit, through a stage of being a demigod to his eventual emergence as God himself, merely visiting the planet Earth, that makes perfect sense when you think, the situation actually deteriorates. Yes, the temple was destroyed in 70, but the state of Israel, Judea, continued, but it disappeared entirely after the third war, the Bar Kokhba rebellion. It was wiped off the map. It was wiped off the map, and even Jerusalem disappeared at that stage. The Romans created a new city on the ruins of the old Jerusalem. So the city itself disappeared along with Judaism, and you had two forces emerge from that final crisis, one being Christianity, but the other being rabbinic Judaism. They are siblings that emerged from that whole period of crisis.
You're listening to the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. We're talking to Ken Humphreys, Great Britain's great mythicist, and he's written a book called Jesus Never Existed. Not really mincing words with that title, Ken, are you? I say you're not really mincing words with the title of your book.
Oh, well, I don't do mincing words. I mean, that's too short. I mean, when Christians will start to say, well, maybe Jesus rose from the dead, and maybe you get saved, perhaps I'll start putting a few
never existed. What are you really trying to say, man? Tell us. Don't hold back. Jesus never existed. Buy it on Amazon.com. Yes, Amazon.com. Can you buy your book on Amazon?
No, they'd have to buy it from the website. That's where they'd have to buy the website, or they get. Or there is I have a U.S. agent over in Charleston, West Virginia, 9-banded books. So let me give a plug for him. You can get a local supply from there. Elsewise, from the website. It's listed on Amazon, but I'm not so fond of Amazon.
And JesusNeverExisted.com is the website.
Yeah, absolutely.
And nine bands publishing, you say, in West Virginia.
Nine banded books out of.
Good. We love West Virginia. It's one of the buckles of our Bible Belt. But I want to tell you, there's active atheists doing what they can in West Virginia for the cause, my friend. So look for Ken Humphreys' book.
Yeah, I hear from some of those people in the Bible Belt, so I know they're like on islands of rationality in a sea of nonsense.
I'm jealous that you're British. I really, tell us that it's easier there than we have it here, fighting 48% of people who deny evolution and teach their kids bad science, and America's really on a bad track. Is it better in Europe? Is what we hear true? Is God kind of a backseat concept, and people sort of chuckle, and the Archbishop is a little bit of a cartoon character?
The situation in Europe is rather different from the States. We don't have an equivalent of your Bible Belt, and we don't have that tradition which comes out of obviously the foundations of the USA of such an attachment to religion. And in fact, what has happened perhaps in recent years, yes, as the old Church of England has faded, we've had happy clappies emerged with a lot of, patronage and support from the USA do exist, and of course immigrants from Eastern Europe tend to come with their more committed religious convictions, so we're having to deal with that as well. But I should say in the world in which I live in southern half of Britain, I mean, it's not even polite to really talk about religion. I mean, people will yawn straight away.
That's good stuff. It's 2:54, and we're going to go a little over to give you the extra time that we hosed you out of during our cock-up at the beginning of the show.
Yes, that is a mistake for our Americans out there.
Brian's got a whole page of British slang up so that we can relate to you.
Yeah, well, you guys at Mythicist Milwaukee, I'm sure, are doing a great job. I mean, the fact that you exist and broadcast, is a step forward. I mean, that wasn't always the case. So more power to your elbow.
Thank you. What's your take on some of the scholars that defend the historical position that Jesus maybe existed, like Bart Ehrman? What is there some validity there, or is it really just nonsense and apologists trying to fit their beliefs into the research?
Well, yeah, I won't dish Bart Ehrman too much. I mean, yeah, we all know the story of Bart Ehrman. He became very committed to the faith, and he went to all the fundamentalist colleges with probably a career in mind to become one of these pillars of apologetics. And yet, because he had the integrity of a scholar, he reported what he found was that the documents were false and forged, and it weakened his faith, and eventually he moved across. He hasn't moved all the way across, and I don't think he will endorse mythicism at the moment. But give him time. But he's done a lot of useful work. But I think he has a problem ditching the Jesus he's always been part of his life. And I think, unfortunately, so many people have come out of, even mythicists, so many of them have come out of a Christian background, and you have this phrase, I don't know, you use it in the States, you hear it a lot in Britain, of a cultural Christian. Whereas they don't necessarily believe any of the dogmas, but they like the church. They like the institution of the church and the way it holds its ceremonies and its music and its cathedrals and so on. So, there's people there who still put their money down on the fable, whether or not they really truly endorse it. They'll go along with that. And yes, if you move away from people like Bart Ehrman to, if you like, more mainstream historians, well, I think they give Jesus the benefit of the doubt. They know the evidence is as flaky as mythicists say, but they don't spend as much time as mythicists do dismantling and deconstructing the stories. They let it under the wire, and it's a bit unfortunate they do that. But I mean, it keeps their lives less controversial. They'll upset a few of their colleagues if they were too outspoken with the truth and what they really believe.
Talk to me about the popular culture as it relates to religion. Your countryman Ridley Scott, one of my favorite directors, of course, recently came out with an utterly cynical movie about Exodus, which, of course, believers will line up to view it as though it were a documentary. There's no way that you're going to convince me that directors and these Hollywood types like Darren Aronofsky, who made Noah last year, there's no way you're going to convince me that these people are believers. They're so cynical in my mind that they're willing to bilk the public, who they know will line up to pay good money to see these. And I don't begrudge them the right to do that. This is the great capitalist society. But do they make it more difficult? Should we be able to count on our artistic community to be a little bit more, a little bit more forthright with their storytelling?
Yeah, we are fighting an entrenched idea, and a lot of businesses are attached to that idea. I've sometimes in talks made the parallel between big tobacco and big religion. I mean, when people blew the whistle and explained and brought to the public's attention how cigarette smoking was lethal, the big tobacco companies didn't line up to say, oh yeah, we agree, we'll just pack up and go home. They fought that tooth and nail, as you know, and that's the same with the churches. I mean, it's been pointed out that lots of clergymen are actually unbelievers. but their whole career, usually their housing is dependent upon playing the game. So, you know, they are among you have probably far more atheists among clergymen than you do among their practitioners.
I definitely can see that.
That's true, and thank you for bringing that up. It came to light during our recent billboard campaign when a Catholic priest came on with a counterpoint and referred to his religious dogma, the story of the birth and death of Christ and resurrection. He referred to it as that whole Jesus story. It became apparent in his tone of voice that even he knew it was a myth. Do you think that that's prevalent? Do you think that that preachers use their what they know that will connect with their audience and preaching to people in a way that they know will communicate, but don't really have any solid belief anymore? Is that pretty common?
Well, how common we don't know, but I'd say it's pretty common. I mean, I occasionally get emails from people who've left the church, and for the most part, they're very painful emails to read because someone is usually describing 20, 25, 30 years of their life before they've been able to say, I've been suckered here by something that is false and based on a lie. And it's taken them half their life usually to come to terms with that, because people don't like to change their minds. You know, they don't like to change their mind. They don't like to acknowledge they've been wrong. But occasionally, and I'd say, you know, not infrequently, look, I hear from people who've been in the church. Some of them have been ministers. Some of them have been apologists, and they've really, you know, now they're parted company from their former colleagues, and they are full of bitterness and you know, unhappiness in many respects. Although they embraced the new freedom of living in reality, they resent the fact that for years they put their energies and their money into these churches and spread the faith, and perhaps for half of those years did so with a great deal of doubt in their own mind. Let me tell you one little story I heard many years ago now, but from a woman who wrote for a Catholic publishing house, and the publishing house issued these booklets about the Lourdes, the healing centre at Lourdes, right? And she said she knew a lot of the stories that she was obliged to edit and write up for these pamphlets were false. Right, she knew that, but at the same time she knew it encouraged a lot of people in their faith and, as it happened, made the church a lot of money. And yet eventually she had to resign because of her conscience got the better of her, and she resigned. And she wrote to me. She wrote to me to saying that was her experience, you know, and it wasn't an easy move for her to make.
That's an incredible story. I think that does some fall into a middle range where they say, okay, well, the stories may not be true, but that's not important. It's the philosophy that really the morality somehow. That goodness really stems from religion, and without religion, the world would be a whole lot worse place.
Oh, yes. I've got a very good friend of mine who argues that position. He is actually a devout Catholic, right? And you can imagine we have some spirited debates from time to time. And his position is often, look, stop taking the history too seriously. Think about the message, right? That's how he lives with this. You know, don't trouble yourself over the facts too closely, right? Just live with the message of it all. And so it's similar to what you're saying there. You know, well, never mind whether it's true or not. It's a good story to tell people. It keeps them on the straight and narrow. You know, well, I question whether it does that. I think it does an awful lot of harm, never mind the straight and narrow. I think it fills people with phobias. It fills them with sense of guilt. You know, it's on a tremendous guilt trip, making people feel bad about themselves. And you know, I can't give it a plus for that side of things. If the story's not true and the moral claims are dubious, then I think it's time to expose proves that for the racket it is.
Certainly with your phobias, I think the fear of going to hell has got to be one of them. Even the guilt of being born with original sin. Especially if you're Catholic. Do you know where the concept of original sin came from? Is that in and around, around the Old Testament, or is that a much later development?
The concept of original sin, well, it's really a Christian idea. It's really same way. Hell is really, a the Jews had Sheol, or Gehenna, where the dead went, but it was really just a short phase before oblivion. But the Christians brought in this notion of everlasting torment. I mean, for people who said they were promoting a loving God, the idea of eternal torment simply for unbelief, that's a pretty nasty turn of thought. Mate, it's always struck me, even as a kid, how absurd it was that you could be very, very good, but if you didn't accept Jesus as your saviour, then you went to hell. And yet, you could be the worst villain in the world, a serial killer or whatever, but if you accepted Jesus, well, okay, you're into heaven. I mean, how monstrous is that?
It's certainly the hell, I think, would violate at least our Eighth Amendment of cruel and unusual punishment. So...
Yeah, very much so. I mean, and of course it follows through if you look at the artwork that the Christians have always produced. I mean, they're very good at depicting hell. They love the torments of hell.
Of course, on the way up here, I put some Ken Humphreys YouTube videos on the box and brushed up on a little bit of your work. And what impressed me as a new mythicist, I'm an old atheist, but I'm a fairly new mythicist. What impressed me about some of the things you said was not only are Jesus's physical attributes and his life story mirrored or copied from earlier myths, quite obviously, but some of his sayings as well. And this was new to me when I listened to your talk. It really impressed me that Jesus's actual sayings, his ideas, his teachings were based on earlier myths. Can you touch on a couple of the big ones there? That intrigued me a lot.
Yeah, it's very true. In fact, what is actually true. It's hard to find an original comment from Jesus, one that hadn't been said already, either in Jewish literature or in the philosophies of the pagans, and he nearly always said it far more eloquently. In a sense, what Jesus says is always rather short and often quite a vulgar rendering of a much more polished idea from someone else. But if you take that classic thing, treat others as you would have them treat yourself. I mean, that you can find that in pagan philosophers' work, and you can find it in the Jewish Old Testament. I mean, I don't know that there's anything you can really say Jesus added to the scene.
I've heard when he was forced to either stone the adulterer or let her go, they were trying to catch him, and he says, he without sin cast the first stone, and kind of defeats everyone. Is that from a previous concept, or is that just cool myth making?
I didn't catch what you were referring to.
Yeah, when he was brought in front of the Pharisees and asked, what should we do with this adulterous woman? To stone her to death, or he who without sin cast the first stone.
Yeah. The woman taken in adultery. You're referring to that? Yeah. Well, it's one of the. I think as spread widely, the knowledge about that passage as being not originally part of the gone. It's and the earliest manuscript, if I can remember correctly, the earliest manuscript that has that is either the 9th century. And what Christians are forced to say is this story circulated independently of the Gospels and then eventually got written into it. I mean, that's a pretty weak claim. I mean, what that story says, and bear in mind its unique character, this is the only place where Jesus writes anything, but we don't know what he writes. It's something in the sand, and we're left to puzzle out what he might have written in the sand. And he makes this comment, sin no more. Well, was she really a sinner? And the other thing that makes it illogical is where is the other half of the other party involved in this act of adultery? It's very, very arbitrary. And, you change the mind. How does this woman get taken in the act of adultery? I mean, it's a real puzzler. But yes, what is interesting about that? It was not part of the original gospel. It's evidence in itself of how the story gathered, like an asteroid gathering parts to become a bigger asteroid. So the story picked up stories probably told about other people, and they thought, that's a nice story, we'll add that to the Jesus story.
Wow, yeah. So it wasn't until, 9th century, 900 A.D. that finally made it in? I mean, that's 800 years even after the last gospel.
Yeah, I believe the oldest manuscript that has that story is something like the 9th or the 11th century. Yeah,
that's incredible.
I mean, it may have existed. It may have existed in earlier forms, right? Yeah, but we are only evidence. I mean, as you know, the Gospels themselves. You don't have any 1st century or 2nd century or even 3rd century Gospels. Our first extant Gospels date from the 4th century.
Well, so really, you can see the evolution of this. I mean, the dates when you see something only to 900, and perhaps it was a bit earlier, but probably not much, because we do know, some of Paul's epistles, I think, are the oldest, and it does suggest that there are many accretions.
Yeah, the process that began with borrowing, for example, borrowing a story from the Old Testament about some other character. We have the cycle of Elisha and Elijah. They have a story in that episode of multiplying food, and it has the element that they were well fed afterwards, and there was a remainder left from the food, except that in that story there was only 100 people involved. Now, when they tell exactly the same story about Jesus, it becomes 4,000 and 5,000 people. It's a bigger version of the story to make it more miraculous, but it's not original. Now, that's how the process of building the Gospels began, but it's blatantly obvious during those early centuries in particular, good tales were added into the story. And that's why the whole compendium of stuff, it reads in such a staccato fashion. It doesn't really flow. It's just add on, and so it came to pass, and then there's this thing happens. It's not a coherent story. You can't actually imagine a eyewitness at the time writing the story in such a hodgepodge of a fashion.
It's the Mythicist Milwaukee Show, and we are out of time. We're down to about 20 seconds. I want to remind everyone to get your tickets for the Myth Information Conference. Speakers coming in, Dr. Richard Carrier, Hemant Mehta, and James Kirk Wall on April 25th at mythicistmilwaukee.com. This has been the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. We've been talking to Ken Humphreys. You got a final thought for us?
A final thought, yeah. Keep the faith. Keep the faith.
Well done. Keep the faith.
Yeah.
And visit.
It's been great being on the show, and I love talking about this Jesus nonsense. So
we'll have you on again.
time.
It's fascinating. We could do it all afternoon. Buy the book. Jesus Never Existed. Buy it now. Take it easy, Ken. Thanks. All right, take it easy.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.
That's it for today. Well, join us next week when we are going to be talking to... Who's up next week, guys? Oh, quick. Next week's guest.
Tell them we're going to be on AM Byte right now.
Yeah, we'll be on AM Byte right now talking, and check out the website for information on... it's Miguel O'Connor next week, the Gnostic maven from Chicago. Oh, we are on next, on Gnostic Byte Radio. So stay tuned for that, and we'll figure out who is the guest next week. You can check it out on the...
That was a cock-up.
Another cock-up.
Timothy Freak.
Timothy Freak. Thank you. There we go. Checking out, everybody.